Hello, this is going to be a build guide for a generator build I've been putting together for the Druid for the past few days. I'm calling it a Stormclaw Druid, which you'll see why that is in a second, and it's built around one particular unique, which is the Greatstaff of the Crone. This gives you a bunch of ranks to claw, and it also causes every claw cast to be a storm skill and also cast Storm Strike at a certain percentage of the normal damage, so a little bit of bonus damage on the Storm Strike. So that's where all of our damage is coming from. Everything else is some form of buff or damage reduction or something like that to assist us in that regard. So I'll start with the skills. Obviously we're maxing out Storm Strike and Claw. You can see we have a bunch of ranks of both of these, and whenever I use Hurricane, it's actually going to go up and have 2 more in each one. And if I had a better Greatstaff of the Crone, this could be all the way up to 19 on the Claw. So you get very, very high ranks of these. For Claw, we're increasing its attack speed and giving it a chance to attack twice, because that scales up our Storm Strike damage as well. And when this double strikes, it also causes Storm Strike to double strike. For Storm Strike, we're obviously taking that, and we're choosing the ability to chain to 2 additional targets. We have plenty of other ways to apply Vulnerable, so this isn't really necessary, and this gives us some much needed AoE, because this build's biggest weakness is dealing with just a lot of stacked low HP targets. It's really annoying trying to cut through them all. We just take movement speed and some crit chance in the core tree. Other than that, we don't take anything. All of those ranks are just from our items. For Earth Shield, we take 1 point in it and then just 1 point in Enhanced Earthen Bulwark to give us the Unstoppable while active. This is just a backup version of Unstoppable, so whenever we're not in our Grizzly Rage, we can get out of CC to make sure we don't die. The barrier is also nice, but it's not really the main point of having it. We have a couple of points in Cyclone Armor, so 1 point in it, and then we're taking the Preserving Cyclone Armor to give us another bit of damage reduction, because I'll get into why in a moment, but as long as you're in there and you're hitting things, you're basically immortal. I mean, you're healing an absolute ton, but in the time it takes you to get in there and actually start hitting things, you can get one shot. So that's what this is for, just to give us that extra little wall of damage reduction to keep us alive while we try to get in there. We're also taking Blood Howl for the heal, and we're choosing the attack speed bonus because this build scales really heavily with attack speed. Also taking 3 out of 3 vigilance for 15% damage reduction every time I use a defensive skill, so any one of these 3, and I have all 3 of them on my bar, gives me 15% damage reduction for a few seconds after using it. And if you pay attention to that and rotate it through it, you can be really, really tanky. Absolutely nothing from the companions. We do take Hurricane, and we're taking enemies affected by Hurricane deal 20% less damage to give us a bit more survivability. And then we're also going to be taking all of these storm passives except for Charged Atmosphere. This seems pretty bad, but all combined, this gives us another way of applying Vulnerable. Increases the duration of our Hurricane. We want really good Hurricane uptime because it gives us +2 ranks to everything. And this also gives us additional lightning damage whenever we're dealing damage to vulnerable or immobilized targets. We're not really going to be stunning things ever. And then another way to immobilize. So just regular lightning damage has a chance to immobilize, and then Storm Strike has its own chance to immobilize. So we're immobilizing targets pretty often and proccing all of these things quite a lot. This also, I didn't mention it, but the lucky hit chance on this build is really quite high, because Claw has a 50% lucky hit chance, and with how often we're using it, that is a really high number. Storm Strike has a fairly high 25%, considering it's hitting like 6 times, because it hits once and then it changes to 4 other targets, or 5 other targets, excuse me, so it's hitting 6 times every cast. So between these two, and you're doing them both at the exact same time, lucky hits proc very reliably. So it's a really decent, anything that has a lucky hit effect on it is definitely decent. We're taking the poison enemies are slowed and using Toxic Claws to be able to apply poison. This is really, really important because this lets us benefit from any bonuses to poison damage, like damage taken from, reduced damage taken from poison enemies, doing poison damage, bonus damage versus poisoned enemies, etc. And that slow also lets us benefit from crowd controlled enemies, although this part isn't as important since Hurricane is up a lot, and that's also slowing targets, so you're already benefiting from crowd control targets there. And poison enemies are taking 30% additional crit damage, which is just an example of how this is scaling really hard with the build, just because of one little point here, even though this poison damage actually isn't doing anything. 2 points in Defiance, just because there's nowhere else I could find to put them that was going to be useful. And that's a decent 8% damage multiplier to elites. And Grizzly Rage is very, very important. So normally Grizzly Rage forces you to be in werebear form, and it gives you damage reduction, gives you stacking bonus damage the longer you're in it. It's a very, very, very strong ability. There is a way to make it work for werewolf builds as well, which I'll get into when we look at our gear. But this also gives us unstoppable the whole time this is active, which is very, very important because it's active a lot. I mean, it's almost 100% uptime, like somewhere between 85 and 90% in most situations if I get a little bit lucky. And so you have unstoppable all that time and can't die to CC. And whenever Grizzly Rage is down, you have Earthen Bulwark to give you a bit more emergency unstoppable if you need to get out of something. It also gives us Fortify per second the whole time that's there. This is our only source of Fortify, so I am sometimes fortified, and it is very helpful, but it's not something I can really rely on like you can with like werebear builds quite as much. You just aren't quite as able to generate it with this build, but it's still very nice to have that. Then for our key passive, we're taking Lupine Ferocity. This is every 6 werewolf skill hit, and instead of just every 6th werewolf skill cast, which is important because Storm Strike is now a werewolf skill and it's hitting 5 times, 6 times every single time you cast it. So basically, every swing is almost a guaranteed crit, or like every other swing. Like it's really, really often that this is causing a crit. And Hurricane's also a werewolf skill, so every time that's taking on everything around you, you'll see in combat this thing is stacking up and then falling off and stacking up and falling off all the time. There is one downside to this, and there is another build idea I've been thinking about with Earthenmite, which I'll get to. But the one downside to this is because Hurricane is a werewolf skill and it can eat this proc. If we're not building into Hurricane at all, it's not doing very much damage. Also, the Storm Strike thing, I'm pretty sure like those chains, they start to do very little damage at the end of the chain. Those can also eat the proc. But when this does proc on like the actual claw or the main Storm Strike, it's a lot of damage, and it's also a source of just a lot of crit happening all the time. Even if the 60% bonus damage can get wasted. So that's it for the skills. We'll look at my gear now. The only unique that is absolutely mandatory is Greatstaff of the Crone. I have not tried this build without these other uniques I'm about to get into, because Greatstaff was the last unique that I got, unfortunately. I feel like it could work while you're leveling, but I haven't tried it. So yeah, you have to have Greatstaff of the Crone. Mine is absolutely terrible. I rolled the minimum on a lot of things, and this build is still pretty strong. The best in slot helmet would be Tempest Roar. This is only best in slot, obviously, unless you get a Harlequin Crest. If you get that, then that's just better, for sure. But what this one does is, other than the stats on it, which are really good, damage while shapeshifted, crit damage, the maximum spirit and poison resistance are pretty worthless, and the lucky hit chance to gain spirit is also pretty bad. But it causes our storm skills to now also be werewolf skills, which is very, very important for the build because it enables Cyclone Armor and Hurricane and Storm Strike, turning them into werewolf skills so that they are benefiting from our Mad Wolf's Glee, which is giving 2 ranks to all werewolf skills. So those 2 uniques are very important put together. And then the last unique that I'm using is Temerity, and this is my main source of defense in the build, which just makes it where we heal a lot, and it converts all of that overhealing into a barrier, effectively giving me up to 80%, but for mine right now it's 56% more maximum health. So this is like my main form of toughness. Most of the time you'll see that I have a barrier active, and it's almost always because of Temerity, sometimes Earthen Bulwark. I'll come back to the gloves in a second because that's the one that's very flexible right now, I think. For the boots, I'm running with, while Hurricane is active, you gain 2 ranks to your shapeshifting skills. Again, because all of this stuff, except for Earthen Bulwark, is now a shapeshifting skill, it all gets plus 2 ranks whenever we have Hurricane active, making that very powerful. And for the neck, I have the basic skills gain a bunch of attack speed. Definitely want this on the neck so you're benefiting from the 50% bonus from the aspects that are on an amulet. So this is giving 45% bonus attack speed to my claw, which again is just the entire build is just spamming claw, so that's a very big multiplier to our damage. The rings are what's making Grizzly Rage work and is a huge part of the power of the build. This ability is insanely important and insanely powerful. So the first one, it converts Grizzly Rage, so now lets you shapeshift into a dire werewolf. So you lose the damage reduction, but you gain a bunch of movement speed, And you also get a pretty big spirit cost reduction multiplier. That isn't important, we're not spending spirit, but it's still very important for the scaling of this build, because this is just letting us use Grizzly Rage as a werewolf. And then with the Rampaging Werebeast, the duration of it is increased by up to 5 seconds, and every single crit while Grizzly Rage is active increases your crit damage by 10% for the duration. So you're critting a lot. You're hitting a lot of things really fast all the time, and you're constantly critting, partly because we're stacking crit chance, and then partly because we're using the Lupine Ferocity. So you stack up crit damage like crazy. You'll see in some footage I'm about to show you, when you don't have Grizzly Rage up, the damage is just like okay. Like you can still kill things at level appropriate content plenty quickly without it. But when Grizzly Rage is active and you start stacking up that crit damage multiplier, and you start stacking up the damage bonus, because that ramps each second while you're in Grizzly Rage, by the end of Grizzly Rage, you are deleting things. You're doing an absolute ton of damage. So it's kind of like a constant like ramping up into huge damage and then falling off a cliff when Grizzly Rage ends, and then you start ramping up again, and it's just like that cycle. But because Grizzly Rage is up so often, it doesn't really end up being a big deal. It's not too often that I'm sitting there hitting things out of Grizzly Rage, not really doing any damage. And again, when you're level appropriate, it doesn't even matter. The footage I'm going to show you, I'm like 16 levels below what I'm fighting, and it's relevant then, but for like between like where I am, 3, 4, 5 levels above me, I'm definitely still one-shotting things. For the Spirit Boons, we're taking the 10% reduced damage from elites. It's the only real option on that tier. 10% attack speed. Could also take the crit chance, but I think attack speed is definitely better. Crit damage is also... There's a lot of good ones here, but... And it would be nice to be able to bond with it, but we'll get to why the snake is pretty mandatory, in my opinion, to be your bond. But I'm taking the attack speed here. And then extending the duration of your ultimate skills by 25% is a no-brainer. Just makes Grizzly Rage even better. We're putting a lot of investment into this and making it as powerful as possible. Then we bond with the snake. You do have one option here. Call Before the Storm is mandatory. This is a big part, again, of Grizzly Rage. We're reducing the cooldown on it with our Lucky Hit. And again, like I said, our Lucky Hit is crazy. We're proccing Lucky Hit all of the time. So this is a huge part of bringing down the cooldown of Grizzly Rage. So this is mandatory. You can choose between these two. I've tested both. I think Masochistic is better. Crits with your shapeshifting skills heal you, because all of this is shapeshifting skills. Hurricane ticking around you. It's not doing any damage, but it is doing damage. And then your claws, the storm strikes, cleaving, everything is a shapeshifting skill. So all of those crits are healing you. And because we're playing with that temerity, none of that overheal, or little of that overheal, is getting wasted, and it's just converting into a barrier. And that's a big part of what keeps us alive. But you could try Overload. I didn't feel like the damage was worth it over the big toughness loss. But I suppose if I was doing like lower level content for some reason, I might want to take that. Or if you think you really need the more AoE damage. Because again, the biggest weakness of the build is just killing like all of the little boys, like the huge waves of like little spiders. It's just, you can kill them. They're not going to kill you or anything. It's just really annoying, just waiting for your Storm Strike to cleave it all down. I did forget to talk about the gloves. So there's like 4 different options on the gloves, and I've been trying them all out except for there's one I haven't tested yet. But right now I'm using the Blood Howl. Increases your crit chance by X percentage, just because this build scales so heavily with crit damage, mostly because of our Grizzly Rage giving us such a huge crit damage multiplier, that I think even more crit chance is just really powerful there. But you could also take the overcharged aspect, which gives you a lucky hit chance to like mark a target, and then every time you hit that target it pulses lightning damage. I really liked that one too for AoE damage. It felt really strong to me, but I felt like the crit chance was better overall. I think I prefer this one over the mark target thing. The mark target is really good just because we're attacking so fast. Like every single time we hit it, we're attacking between 2 and 4 times depending on if Claw double swings, and we're attacking, like you can see, our attack speed is pretty quick. So it can proc that lucky hit thing pretty often. So that's one option. This is another. The one that I think is actually going to be the best is the expectant aspect, which gives you like up to 20-ish% bonus damage based on your how much your available resource. Since we don't spend spirit and this is just always at max, that would just be like a flat 20% damage multiplier on the whole build. that'll probably be the best. It's just disabled right now and doesn't work. The other thing that I haven't experimented yet with is there's an aspect that causes your Earthen Might passive to work with storm skills, which would mean that it would work with like all of our skills, because our storm skills are now werewolf skills. So the Earthen Might passive gives us a lucky hit chance to restore all of your spirit and cause your attacks to be guaranteed crits for 5 seconds. Obviously, the spirit doesn't matter, but the causing all of your attacks to be guaranteed crits for 5 seconds could be very, very good. And that's definitely going to need some testing. This would be the no-brainer, but because, again, like I said, this gets eaten by bad damage a lot of the time, and not always by like your Storm Strikes and your Claws you want it to get eaten by, it's not as great as it might seem. So this definitely has some potential here. I just haven't tested it yet. So last thing is the Paragons. I'm not going to get super in-depth here. I'm going to have a link to the planner in the description that you can look at to get actually like really look at all these. But basically, I'm using the Werewolf Glyph on the starter board. I'm dipping into Thunderstruck to gain 30% increased crit damage with all of the storm skills, and there's some other benefits down there. And then the Heightened Malice board is important. I'm using Exploit. This is like the most mandatory glyph. It gives you extra vulnerable damage, and most importantly, it gives you another way to apply vulnerable, like guaranteed. So the moment you enter combat, everything's vulnerable for 3 seconds, which is extremely, extremely nice. And the vulnerable damage on top of that is just insane. And on this board, we pick up a lot of nodes that give us damage to poisoned enemies and damage reduction from poisoned enemies and stuff like that, which is just a big part of our toughness and our damage. And then Heightened Malice is very, very strong. So while you're in those AoE situations, you're surrounded by things, you're just clicking on the elites, you're getting a 45% damage multiplier as long as 3 or more of them are poisoned. And because you're cleaving and all of your crits apply poison thanks to that Toxic Claws passive, this is active all the time, and it's just a huge damage multiplier. And I won't get into the rest of it, it's not super important, but you can see it in that D4 planner. So this is what I put together. So far it's been working out really well for me. When I'm doing level appropriate or up to +3 Nightmare Dungeon level stuff, I'm just breezing through it super, super fast. And I'm going to show you some uncommentated footage of the build working in a Nightmare Dungeon like 44, I think it is, to make the monsters level 98. And you can see it's really, really easy. The gameplay's really easy. You're extremely tanky, you're very durable, and as long as you have Grizzly Rage active, you are completely immune to CC, and you're shitting out an absolute ton of damage. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I'm just gonna leave it over to that Nightmare Dungeon now. Thank you for watching, and just like leave in the comments if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer. Bye bye.